I mean, this is absolutely doable. And so is this, but some assembly required, if you know what I mean. Welcome back to the Mentor Roulette grind. This time, we're playing some more Sage, and we're back in, what do you mean groups bigger than 4 players? With a very dungeon-heavy duty distribution, which matches with my previous observation about Mondays, weirdly. Now, we started the session with Sirensong Sea with what appears to be a first-timer tank, although over the course of the duty, it seemed like the tank improved exceptionally fast. Like, in the start of the duty, they were sometimes single-targeting on AoE packs. By the third pull or so, they stopped doing that, and once we had beaten the first boss, they started to pull bigger and get more proactive with defensive cooldowns. Were they actively reading or watching a guide between pulls, or what was happening here? This kind of improvement, pull for pull, is wild. Another completely different thing is the positioning of our Bard Sprout here. For the most part, it wasn't really an issue, as I was able to position myself around it, but I got the impression that the Bard is a true knower of Narnia, and they were really seeking out this place in every single boss room. Boss mechanic forces you to come closer? Okay, but immediately after, backpedal to a decent distance. Boss forces you away? Alright, I'll just stay out here then, with my completely free mobility. I started really noticing this behavior on the final boss because it seemed so excessive at times, but it turned out they did this on all of the bosses, which is a bit funny. Again, it didn't hurt anyone, and ultimately I could play around it, but it was a bit strange. Finally, no one interrupted seducing Scream, but the Bard did respond when I mentioned it. For Duty 2, we're going to the level 89 dungeon of Endwalker, which is quite spoilery, so if you'd rather not see this, jump to this timestamp right now. Now, of course, the duty is the Aitiascope. We had a lot of perfectly normal mistakes, like getting hit by a slightly confusing mechanic and so on. However, there were a few oddities with the tank in particular. First, I did not see them sprint once in the entire duty. Now, I understand some people don't quite see the value in sprinting, and in fact I've heard some say that sprinting is just for the impatient or something weird like that. Not only is sprint an indirect DPS cooldown, but it is also a direct defensive cooldown. Let me explain. Sprint increases your movement speed by 30%, which means you can increase the gap between you and the mobs chasing you, which will mean they get even less free hits on you while you round up mobs. Yes, sometimes it will lead to you being too far away to spam shield lob or whatever, but more importantly, by making sure the mobs are running after you as much as possible, by staying ahead, you clump up all of the packs more quickly, which means your group can really start cleaving the mobs down sooner. Many DPS players will, and honestly should, hold on to their burst until all of the mobs are there. So if it takes you even one more second to reach your destination than it needed to, that's potentially wasted time. To put it into perspective just how strong sprint is, when I've soloed Gigapulls, when I'm just casually walking away, I often need to use one big cooldown just to survive the hits that reach me while running away from the blob. But when I use sprint, I almost completely stop taking damage, and even the ranged mobs will start to do less damage. Sure, using sprint perfectly to maximize your speed is a skill in and of itself, but simply using sprint is a good thing. It doesn't really cost you anything, so use sprint. The tank never sprinting was further compounded by their all the way to the wall style of pulling. They pulled the entire pack of mobs all the way until they could move no further, which of course saves a bit of time after the mobs are dead, I guess, like a few seconds or something. But moving the mobs also causes problems for the rest of the group in dealing damage, or settling down depending on the job. For example, a ninja cannot put down Danton before the tank stops moving. This is perhaps a little bit of a case of preference, but I do highly recommend that you stop running further once you've picked up the last pack you want to grab. I also think that never sprinting and moving the pack to the wall is a terrible combination. Finally, and this is a much smaller thing, but for some reason the tank would run up all the way to the boss and then use shield lob to pull with, consistently. First off, if they run all the way up anyway, why not just fast blade? And if they're going to shield lob, why not do it sooner? And they are a paladin, why are they using shield lob for this and not Holy Spirit, honestly? As you can probably tell from the footage, it's not like any of these issues caused any major problems in the duty, but I'm just saying, it could be better. I actually have a video on the subject of running dungeons faster if you are interested, link in the description. For Duty 3, I am a 7-minute replacement in Aurum Vale. I zone in, walk up to the group, and the tank just goes for it all the way to the boss room. Now, the thing is, that particular pull might have been possible, but we didn't have any control over all the mobs being pulled, so everyone just gradually died. I also feel like the tank wasn't skilled enough to pull it off, even had they kept enmity on everything. I also told them as much, that it could be possible, but is absolutely not recommended. And we had a bit of a talk about how to get it done, and I sort of directed them for a safer pull sequence. Stick to the left, hold to the wall. I also showed how you need to pull the lilies into the boss room because of the patrols. It turned out the bard was directing their tank friend who was very new, and the bard had misunderstood something. That's perfectly fine. What matters here is that we learned, right? We had no major issues for the rest of the duty, and at this spot before coin counter, I highlighted a safe path and again yoinked the tank into the room for safety reasons. As we approached the end of the duty, I also noticed that the warrior tank didn't have Surging Tempest up despite AoE fights, so we talked a bit about Mithril Tempest. What a good ending to such a concerning start. For Duty 4, we land in the Great Hunt Extreme, which itself is a very interesting duty, especially as a healer. You can only use your healing spells in the first half of the fight, which means that there is a massive significance in doing so in the first half, to make sure the group preserves as many Mega Potion charges as possible for the second half. Another thing healers can do is every time a dot is applied to someone, Ishuna works, which can massively reduce the damage the group takes. Finally, and this is the weird one, any action that generates a shield on its own will still work. Meaning, for example, that a Dark Knight's TBN will work and Haima, which generates a shield based on potency, will work. But you've Creation Diagnosis, which heals and then generates a shield based on the exact healing done, will not work, as when we enter the second half of the fight, everyone gets a debuff that prevents you from receiving healing from anything but the Mega Potion. This aspect, of course, also means that of all the tanks, by far the strongest one for this duty is probably Dark Knight, since all the healing from Gunbreaker and Warrior would not work, and Clemency from a Paladin wouldn't either. Anyway, the reason why I'm more just talking about the duty at large is because everything went fine. For Duty 5, we went to Tower of Babil, which went very well. The tank was very good and reliable, and we even got to do the chasm pull here. Did you know you can pull the mobs across the chasm? I will say, which refers back to the Aitiascope thing, that personally, I prefer to pull the first pack and then go to the bridge where the second pack is. That means you have much less of a run to the next packs after the pull. This is of course highlighting the particular difference between pulling everything to the wall just because, and pulling everything near the wall because that's where the pack is anyway. Of course, in this context, it is a matter of a few seconds of extra running that you could have done instead of waiting for the bridge mobs to come to you. Another completely different thing I noticed is that the Reaper seemed very lost on boss mechanics, and the duty in general. That is of course perfectly fine. But I did find it very strange that they used Arcane Circle before combat starts. This is a weirdly common mistake I see some players do. I think the logic is that you want to set up your buffs before fighting, but this actually wastes time on the cooldown. You should almost always wait with using cooldowns like this until you are already in combat and actively fighting to make sure you make the most of every second of the cooldown. I have a video that goes over these kinds of things in more detail as well, link in the description. Of course, as I mentioned, these minor things didn't really cause any major problems in the duty, and we completed it just fine. For Duty 6, we went to Great Gubal Library. The tank was a first-timer and also a returning player. The Red Mage also said they were new. Presumably, the Summoner was also new. This is, of course, completely fine. However, where it started to get a bit concerning is that every boss, it seemed like all 3 players were completely lost. Like, I understand some of the mechanics are not entirely obvious, but surely you will learn when you get hit by a mechanic for the 3rd or 4th time, right? I want to preface this by saying that all 3 did learn when it became necessary. With that, let's take it one by one. On the first boss, most everyone repeatedly got hit by the slow heavy debuff from the Dark Floor. It seemed like they weren't even trying to avoid it. What confused me the most about this is that surely they could see that I was dodging and didn't get punished, so it surprised me they didn't learn this over the course of the fight itself. For the second boss, I usually try my best to take the reins on sending these orbs to the boss myself. The way it works is that when the book is defeated, whoever is closest to it gets the orb. You then need to lead the orb into the boss. However, in the second set, I discovered that another player running into the orb fizzles it entirely, apparently. So I ended up using Rescue to direct the Summoner, because it seemed like they were just fleeing from the orb. On the final boss, I ended up running a circuit to take all the single player circles, and no one even tries to help me with the 2 and 3 player circles, which causes us to get overwhelmed with ads and promptly wipe. I have a talk with the group, making sure all 3 are paying attention before I explain. We talk about how the fight actually works, and I want to say, considering how terrible the first attempt was, and also all of the mistakes leading up to this, just take a look at how well this is handled on the second try. For 1 player circles, most everyone took 1 or 2 each. For 2 player circles, we actually managed to split up somewhat. And for 3 player circles, while not necessary, the fact everyone participated, I think, is a great thing. You may recall a previous episode of this series where I praised my group for doing the circles even when the boss was about to die and it didn't matter, because I would much rather have a group that prioritizes mechanics. This is kind of what I mean. The alternative is disaster. Once again, such a concerning start leading to such a good ending. For Duty 7, we're back in the lost city of Amdapor hard, and the ninja looked like a first-timer. I've gone over the weird mechanics of this dungeon in a previous episode, but what I found interesting here is that the performance of this group was such that each boss took significantly longer. That's not an issue, just an observation. Which meant we got a much greater chance to actually see the boss mechanics and how they resolve. The fights prolonging like this, of course, also caused mistakes to be more punishing. For example, on the first boss, we had near wipe situations because of how the hallucinations overlapped, leading to very little space to stand in at times. On the second boss, we discovered that the resistance down debuffs get flipped at some point. And on the final boss, we did have some minor awkwardness with Cure 4, but once again, it's not like the boss could actually out-heal our damage if things went wrong, so the duty went just fine. For Duty 8, we went to Copperbell Mines hard, another one of the weird ones. In this case, it seemed like everyone knew what to do, so the run went extremely easily. In fact, on the final boss, it seemed both of the DPS helped with feeding the worm the crystals, so I didn't have to. However, that was the reason why I was standing kind of over in Narnia so that I could grab a crystal if needed. Just an excellent group all around. For Duty 9, we went to Antitower, and again, everyone was excellent. However, this gives me an opportunity to talk about something else. Sometimes in these episodes I bring up how I can't communicate with someone in the group due to a language barrier, and sometimes I highlight how sprouts make mistakes as well. Obviously, both of these things are perfectly normal. However, I do want to highlight that in this particular group we had a French-only language player that was also a sprout that played perfectly well. Is that important? No, but just like how some players believe all clickers are bad because they only count the actually bad ones and ignore the good ones, or don't notice the good ones because they don't stand out, I think it is equally important to highlight how not all of the players you meet that might not speak the same language as you are bad. Many of them are great. In fact, often we might not even notice we can't communicate because it ends up being unnecessary. That is to say, remember that each time you meet a baddie, you might have met a dozen goodies that had the same kinds of quote-unquote limitations. Whether that is playing as a clicker, not speaking a language, or god forbid, being new to the game, or alternatively wearing a mentor crown, of course. It's just very easy to clamp onto the bad ones you meet. And finally for duty 10, we have Qitana Ravel, which was another perfectly good run, although it was clear some mechanics needed to be relearned given the mistakes I saw from the tank. The only real highlight of issues here is that I didn't quite appreciate the Reaper just eating the tether attack on the final boss. For those that don't know, the boss puts a pink spiky tether on someone and a few seconds later dashes them for heavy damage and a vulnerability stack. Remember, most mechanics that apply vulnerability stacks apply them as a punishment for messing up. How do you not mess up this mechanic? Well, when you see the spiky pink tether, run away, at least until it turns purple and loses the spikes. Once you've reached that point, the damage massively reduces and you will not be given a vulnerability stack. Also, once again, this group was, as I mentioned, perfectly fine, despite potential language barriers. Another good session, although I do wish we had a bit more variety. I do wonder if Tuesdays have a greater concentration of extremes like I observed last week, or maybe it was something else that caused that to happen. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Endwalker, Warrior's Mithril Tempest only extended the duration of the buff from Storm's Eye by 10 seconds, capping at 30 seconds. In Endwalker, not only were Mithril Tempest allowed to grant the buff itself from nothing, but anything that applied the buff can extend it up to a full minute. Notably, Mithril Tempest granting the buff also means it's the only way to get the buff before level 50, which is the reason why it was so obvious for me the warrior was not using specifically Mithril Tempest in Aurum Vale.